Welcome everyone to lesson 4 of your journey in the Bible. I'm so grateful to be able to teach you guys and to encourage and inspire you. Ultimately, the success of this class is measured by how many people actually find that they're getting into their Bibles more than they were before. They're learning from their Bibles. They've got a new Bible study habit in their life. It's coursing through their veins, it's penetrating their mind, and it's changing your lives, okay? So that's the way that the success of this course is to be measured, okay? Not whether we sat through a session and learned a few facts, okay? So here we are, we're talking about lesson 4, Old Testament history and poetry today. Here we are just at discussion point to talk about how is it going with figuring out your plan for your day, how you're going to get prayer and Bible study into your daily routine, and how you're going to set out in order to read the entire Bible, short time or long, but you're going to methodically work through it, or maybe ad hoc work through it, but you're going to work through it such that at the end you could say, yes, I read every word of the scriptures. The two goals that we see from the life of Jesus here, right? This is our anchor scripture, Matthew 4, verse 4. And it's not a doctrine, it's not a big doctrinal scripture. It's where we're seeing the life of Jesus. We're looking at the life of Jesus, and this is where Jesus is tempted. He actually faces his temptations. He faces the devil. He faces the tempter. He said, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So the two things I take away from this is we want to do something daily, which is what it must have taken Jesus in order to get to a point where he's fluent in adulthood with the scriptures. He's able to call them to mind. He's able to bring them to bear on life situations, and that it's a matter of living the kind of life that God wants us to live, right? That it's every word that comes from the mouth of God, so we get through the whole Bible, short time or long, but that we're able to do so in such a way that it changes our lives. So thank you, Rakithan. That was great. Anyone else want to share about your progress so far, either in making your plans or putting your plans into prayer? Is it changing your pattern? Is it changing your life? The topic for today is Old Testament history and poetry. Okay, that is the books from Joshua through Song of Songs. Now, those are really two separate things, but we only allocated ourselves 6 weeks to get through the Bible. So the Old Testament history, which was really Joshua through Esther, got lumped together with Job through Song of Songs. Okay, so we've got 2 different lessons to do today. Actually, the poetry, I'm gonna use a much shorter lesson section, but really there is tons to learn. There is tons of insight you will gain into the scripture if you understand the history and geography of Israel. Okay? If you don't have a clue about the history and geography of Israel, then you will hear and see all these names going by and you just glaze over. You say, yeah, okay, woe to somebody or other. Yeah, because they did some bad stuff. Okay, woe to somebody or other because they attacked Israel. Woe, or then Israel went to battle against so-and-so. And it's somewhere over there in that area at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Am I right? Do you relate to what I'm saying? That's what happens. So here is a history of Israel in 11 parts with approximate dates. Now, these approximate dates are so that you will know approximately when things happened. Because I think if all those were like as precise as we could possibly get to, you wouldn't remember any of them. But I just want to encourage you to think this way. Abraham, historically, lived about 2100 BC. Okay? Or you could say 2000, plus or minus 100 years, doesn't matter. Okay? In other words, Abraham lived as far before Christ as we live after Christ. So when Jesus and the apostles were talking about Abraham, he was as ancient to them as Jesus and the birth of Christianity is to us. So the patriarchs are about 2,000. Abraham lived 2,100. He actually lived for over 100 years. So whether it's 2,100 or 2,000, it doesn't really matter. The point is, Abraham was back then. And then he had sons, right? He had Isaac and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you will hear over and over in the Old Testament. And you got to know, okay, that's Abraham was the one to whom God made a promise that he would give this promised land. If he would leave his homeland and come to the new land, God would made a promise of land, and he made a promise of progeny, of descendants. Okay, and so Isaac, Jacob, and by the way, what's Jacob's other name? Israel. So the nation of Israel is the nation of Jacob. In other words, it's the descendants of Jacob. And Jacob's sons, how many sons did he have? 12 sons. And how many tribes of Israel were there? 12 tribes. Okay, we'll talk about a glitch there in a minute. But Jacob went down to Egypt because of the famine. You remember that? And how long were they in Egypt? About 400 years. So that's going to get us to roughly the middle of the 15th century BC. That's about 1440. Because how long were when the Israelites came out of Egypt, how long were they wandering in the desert? 40 years. Okay, so it's not these dates that are as important as some of these, it's just the periods, right? They were wandering in the desert for 40 years. So approximately the entry into the promised land, okay, and the conquest occurred about 1400 BC. Okay, so we got 2000 BC for Abraham. We got 1400 BC is the Exodus, the wandering in the desert, and the entry into the promised land. Then the conquest happened over somewhere between 5 and 20 years, and frankly, it was never quite completed. And then there's a period of judges. People estimate that was about 400 years. I think looking at the dates, probably more like 320, 350 years, something like that. But you have the period of the judges, and then Israel gets its first king. And its first king was not David. The most famous king was David. Its first king was Saul. But then David came. And about what year was David crowned king? About 1000 BC. So you sort of cut the difference. You've got Abraham at 2000 BC. You've got David crowned king at 1000 BC. And by the way, the Bible refers to David as reigning for 40 years. Solomon is reigning for 40 years. Saul before him is reigning for 40 years. Probably a little bit, that's probably sort of a round number they're using. Scholars think that maybe Saul reigned about 22 years and maybe David around 43 years, and Solomon about 40 years. Okay? But you get the idea. There was a civil war under Solomon's son, and the nation broke apart. And so for another period of time, maybe from approximately 920 BC to 722 BC, the nation of Israel was actually two parts. It was the nation of Judah in the south with Jerusalem, and the nation of Israel in the north, or otherwise referred to as Ephraim. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. So that lasted for about 200 years. And we actually have a very, very positive date, 722. Okay, historians know this date very well. This was the date that the Assyrian King Sennacherib actually came and destroyed, overwhelmed the capital of the kingdom of the north, Israel, which was Samaria. And they overwhelmed the kingdom of the north, and they took them into exile, and they brought a bunch of foreigners and settled them in the land. and that was the end of the northern kingdom. But the southern kingdom continued. So you had the United Kingdom period. The divided kingdom was that period from the civil war within Israel until Assyria wiped out the northern kingdom, called Israel. And then there was a period thereafter that we'll just call Judah alone. So Judah in the south continued. It survived the invasion of the Assyrians. The next empire that came along, the Babylonians, ended up taking them out. And we have a very, very precise date for that as well, 586 BC. And when I say very precise in ancient terms, it's sort of like plus or minus a year. But 586 BC, the Babylonians wiped out not only Judah, but Jerusalem. They tore down the walls. They burned the temple with fire. After 586, all the noblemen were taken into exile in Babylon, and we have the period of the Babylonian exile. And that lasted for 70 years, as predicted by the Lord through the prophet Jeremiah. The fact is that there were multiple exiles. The first one was perhaps about 606 BC, but that wasn't the destruction of Jerusalem. It was like Babylon was exerting its influence over Judah, and they decided, look, you guys are being too rebellious, so we're going to take a bunch of you into exile. And that was when Daniel went into exile. It was when Ezekiel went into exile. And so 606 to 536 is about 70 years. Okay, but 586 was the year that Jerusalem fell. So that's important to understand. And then after 536, Judah was restored. You all have been introduced now to the history of the Jews from the creation of the world until Israel was destroyed. Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Okay. Now this final period that I've called Judah restored is also just called by scholars as the Second Temple period. Can you imagine why it would be called the Second Temple period? It's because they rebuilt the temple, the one that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Okay, so they rebuilt the temple as part of the return from exile. It was and oh, by the way, it was added to, and Herod really built the Second Temple up to a tremendous level, such that it was quite massive and quite impressive. But the Romans eventually took it down in 70 AD. So that is the history of the Jews on a single slide. Okay, so does this help? I find it helpful to be able to put the whole history on one slide. You can fit it in your brain. And now when you read, guess what? You're going to say, oh, so-and-so is threatening exile. Oh, well, I know that must be, I can now place that. I can now place that in here. Now, the section of books we're going to read is sometimes called the former prophets. Former prophets? I thought we were doing Old Testament history. I mean, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, are those prophets? Well, in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, they're considered the first four from among the prophets. They're not part of Torah, they're part of the prophets. Now, in the Christian ordering of the Bible, and remember, these are originally just scrolls, so the ordering is not official or part of the inspiration of the Bible. They could be in any order, but the ordering just helps us understand them, helps give sense to them. And so the Christian order was really derived from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in about 200 BC called the Septuagint. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. And by the way, this was a Jewish work. So it's not like Christians decided to reorder the Bible. Christians just decided to use the Greek translation because Christians weren't just Jews. They were people from all over. And so they tended to use the Greek translation of the Bible. So they ended up with the Septuagint ordering of the books. So, but the question is this a history? Are these history books we're reading, or are they prophets? And so the answer to that is definitively they're prophets. Okay, they're the former prophets. And what then makes a history book a prophetic book? It's a prophetic book because it's not just recording the facts, it is interpreting the facts from God's perspective. And only a prophet could communicate that. Only a prophet would know definitively, look, this is what God thinks about the circumstances that happened. And oh, by the way, during the period of the kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, Judah had about 20 kings and Israel had about 20 kings. And you know how many of the Israelite kings, the ones up in the north, that the prophets seem to think were good kings? 0. 0 for 20. And you know how many prophets in the south in Judah that the prophets seem to think were good kings? About 8. So they're 8 for 20 down in the south. Okay? So these are prophets because we're hearing God's perspective. We're hearing a spiritual interpretation of what's going on. And a lot of what's related is bad stuff that's going on. So don't get wigged out that there's bad stuff going on in the Bible. The fact is there was bad stuff going on in the people. And the Bible records that, and the Bible interprets that. It says, you know, they just disobeyed. They were worshiping idols. They were involved in sexual immorality. They were not being kind to the poor or to the foreigner living in your borders. Man, and the Lord was angry with them. Hey, that's a prophetic work. Now we're talking about mapping history onto the books of the Bible. We already talked about the Torah last week. I'm not going to go into that in detail. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's notable, though, that Exodus occurs at the beginning of the 40 years, and Deuteronomy is at the end of the 40 years. Right? Deuteronomy is the final address by Moses to the people before he dies and before they're about to go into the promised land. But now we're talking about the Old Testament history books. Now you'll notice some of these were considered in the Jewish Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, to be former prophets, and some were considered to be the writings. But when they all got translated into Greek, and therefore when the Christians adopted the ordering of the books of the Bible, they got sort of mixed in there. So it's sort of chronologically. So what you see is roughly a chronological view of the history of Israel as represented in the available books in the Bible, which really take on a historical narrative sort of approach. Here's a test for you, and you can refer back to this slide when you're thinking about it throughout the week. Can you, in one sentence or phrase, describe what's in each of these books? Okay? I've done so here on this slide. In the book of Joshua, there's the conquest of Canaan, which is the promised land. The promise given to Abraham. Finally, the descendants of Abraham are going in and taking possession of that which was promised to their forefather. The Judges was approximately the first 400 years in Canaan. And they didn't have a king, and they didn't do so great. Okay, they were really pretty disobedient to God. The book of Ruth is kind of slipped in there. That's during the period of the Judges, and it's a story about the faithful great-grandmother of David. She was a Moabitess, okay, that is a woman from Moab, and she gets connected with the nation of Israel through a set of circumstances, and so it's a faithful story of David's great-grandmother. All right? 1st and 2nd Samuel is about the kings, Saul and David. So it's really the three major characters in 1st and 2nd Samuel are Samuel, Saul, David. Then we get into 1st and 2nd Kings, and it moves on into Solomon and all of the kings of Israel and Judah, including the Civil War etc. So it's all about the nations of Judah and Israel all the way till their exile. First and Second Chronicles is the same thing as what was just told in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, but it repeats it. Now, it repeats it from a perspective of having returned from exile. So, if someone wrote a history about the Vietnam War in 1975, they might emphasize different things than if someone wrote a history of the Vietnam War in 2020. They might emphasize different things. And this is what we have. There are different things emphasized because they were really written or compiled or edited at different times from different sources. So First Chronicles takes a different approach to the history of the Jews from First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, but it covers roughly the same period, roughly the same events. It does focus on the nation of Judah in the south and the line of Judean kings. It does not focus on the kings of the north. All right? Ezra and Nehemiah talk about the return from exile, okay, after, and by the way, they didn't come back from Babylon while Babylon was still rolling. Babylon had to be conquered by the Persians, and then the Persian king had a different strategy toward how to manage all the peoples that were in exile in his empire. And so he said, we ought to resettle people in their lands. And you know what? All these lands are really difficult to manage. We should resettle them, and we should in fact enable them to worship the gods of their lands, to make those local gods happy. And if the local gods are happy, then the area will prosper, and our empire will prosper. So King Cyrus of the Persians was the one who issued the edict that the Jews could return from captivity. So the Babylonians were not as friendly to the Jews going home. Ezra and Nehemiah is about 3 different waves of return. The first wave of return was Zerubbabel, okay, who was in the line of David. So he might have been a king if the kingship was allowed at the time. He might have been a king. And then the next wave was Ezra coming back it was some 50 years later, 60 years later. So Zerubbabel came back and rebuilt the temple. And then Ezra comes back and reinstitutes the temple worship. And no, probably not the temple worship, but just the study of Torah and the teaching of the Israelites to obey the scriptures. And then Nehemiah comes back about 10 or 20 years after Ezra and starts rebuilding the wall. So they're different returns. So they're 3 different exiles, major exiles that we have recorded. There are 3 different returns. But so Ezra and Nehemiah records all 3 of those returns. Esther just happens to be a story of the deliverance of the Jews while in Persia. So it was very interesting to me to learn from Jewish history that it's estimated that there were 2 million Jews living in Babylon at the time of the return, and probably only about 50,000 returned. So actually a huge center of Jewish thought and scholarship remained in Babylon. And there were only 50,000 or so that came back to restore things in Jerusalem and in Judah. So a lot of people stayed behind in Babylon, or what was then Persia. Okay, but Esther is a book about a woman, a Jewish woman, who became queen in Persia, and through becoming a queen, was able to save her people from extinction in Persia, or from significant genocide. Okay, so that's a story about Queen Esther. So again, so now we've made another pass through Israelite history, but now we've mapped them onto the books. Okay? It's starting to become a little clearer. So if you pick up 1 Samuel now, hopefully you'll have an idea. Okay, I kind of have an idea where we're picking up the story. The books of poetry. I'm going to be much more succinct about the books of poetry. When we talk about the books of poetry, we talk about the next 5 books in the Christian order, and that's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Okay, Job is a beautiful story about Job and how he goes from prosperity to poverty. His family's wiped out, his deep suffering, and he honors God. And then, so it's about the meaning of suffering. Okay, if you just want to know what the book of Job is about, it's musings on the meaning of suffering. God ends up coming in and talking with Job, and then God restores all of his fortunes. Okay, the book of Psalms is a collection, an anthology, if you will, of songs of praise and lament. There are 150 of them, and over half of them are written by David, or ascribed to David anyway, and there are others ascribed to other people, okay? The various song leaders in David's court, Asaph and Korah and so forth, are also authors of some of the Psalms. The Proverbs is wisdom to live by, mostly written by Solomon, but not all. So these are collections of wise sayings, super easy to read. A lot of people love Proverbs because they're so practical, so easily, but it's not all the scripture. So Proverbs are fun to read, but there's a lot more to the scripture than just the Proverbs. Ecclesiastes, essentially an exploration of the meaning of life. What is true meaning in life? And Solomon comes to the conclusion, and maybe he knew this in advance, but he goes through a journey to get there, actually. But he comes to the conclusion that the meaning of life is to love and serve God. And then the Song of Songs is Hebrew love poetry. What's its purpose? Maybe to show that married love is a good thing in God's eyes. Okay? It's a little racy at times, right? You wouldn't think that that stuff would be in the Bible, but there it is, 8 chapters of erotic love poetry. Okay? It's not super racy. It's actually no racier than some of Proverbs and some of the prophets. This is a super important principle of biblical interpretation. Okay, if you want to read the Old Testament and be edified by it, be built up, be encouraged, and find that it's going to affect your life, let me exhort you in this way. To understand why a book is important to us, we must first understand why it was important to them. People love to talk about how hard it is to read Chronicles, First Chronicles, because it starts off with 9 chapters of genealogies. Well, if you were coming back from 70 years of exile in Babylon, back to your homeland, wouldn't you kind of want to know what your roots are? Wouldn't you? And oh, by the way, if the land was apportioned to 12 different tribes of people, wouldn't you kind of want to know who belongs to what tribe? So that therefore you know whose land is what? When you understand this, you gain an appreciation. Now, you may not be thrilled to read it, but you appreciate it, right? And oh, by the way, then you understand maybe this isn't that important for me. Maybe it's not that applicable to me. But what you will find is that the more you become familiar with the names in those genealogies, you'll see things being emphasized in those genealogies that indicate the priorities of the authors and the editors. And by the way, pretty much the whole biblical canon is generally understood to have been that is, we're talking about the Old Testament. Under the era of Ezra, Ezra began a biblical scholarship back in Israel, and it was understood that the school of scholars that was around Ezra may well have been responsible for the finalization, the gathering of all the scrolls, the pulling them back all together, say, okay, this is our holy scriptures. We've always known the Torah. We've always known those five books were it. But now we know, here are all the prophets, and man, there are all these other writings. These are pretty awesome too. So, by the way, but the point is that return from exile was so important in many of these books. You read certain things and you think, from the perspective of someone coming back from exile or resettling in their historic land, I can see why this would be so important. And oh, by the way, when you understand why it's important to them, you'll start to understand why it can be important to you. Okay, what's up with the violence? When you read Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, you will read about a lot of violence. And there are wars that, if someone attacks you, you got to defend yourself, don't you? But there's a lot of war of conquest. And how do we understand that? Okay, what's up with all the violence? Well, let's just say there are a variety of possible explanations. One is that a guideline for a nation may be different than a guideline for an individual. Like what a nation is supposed to do might be different than what an individual is supposed to do. Jesus taught a lot about turning the other cheek and not hating your enemies and so forth. Well, why are these guys going on these war rampages? First of all, just read it. Just understand it for what it is. Don't worry about judging it. But also, the Canaanites were super evil. And it says this in the scripture that this was God's judgment on the Canaanites as much as it was him providing or him making good on his promise to Abraham. Or I don't know if it's equal. The point is, God knows everything. And he knew that these guys, they sacrificed their kids in the fire. So human sacrifice of children, it's not great. Okay? We want to kind of get rid of that. And their religion was oriented around shrine prostitutes, and so a lot of sexual immorality. So anyway, the Canaanites had it coming to them. And maybe God knew when he made the promise to Abraham, what was that, some 600 years prior, he knew, the Canaanites are going to need to go 600 years from now. So I'm going to make this promise to Abraham, give them a place, and get rid of the Canaanites. But also it's maybe about keeping Israel holy. When you intermingle with another people, you pick up the values of that other people. And so keeping your values straight is a very tricky thing. There's also some hyperbole, okay? When it says, we went into this city and we killed every man, woman, and child. Well, but then you read there were a lot of men, women, and children left. So maybe they didn't kill every man, woman, and child. And maybe they were driving people out as much as killing them. Okay? So there's some hyperbole here, perhaps. In any case, it's okay to ask questions. It's not great to try to fault God. Okay? He's a big guy. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. He created everything. He'll take everything out eventually, and God knows what he's doing. So just be aware. There's plenty of violence that's not sanctioned by God. There's some violence that is directed by God. Think about it. Something to meditate on. Okay, there are a lot of important characters. You can do a self-test quiz to see if you know who all those people are. Now, what I'm going to hope given that we only have 22 minutes left, what I'm going to hope is that this next section, what it's going to do is it's going to, in some senses, repeat the history that I've just told you, but do so in maps. Okay? So I'm going to move over here next to this screen. And this is a super important thing that you're going to want to know in reading the historical books and the prophets, because there are all kinds of names mentioned. And you should just understand that most of the names, in fact, what we have over here this is the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, these look like regions, like our states, right? These look like regions, don't they? Well, the fact is that the name of a person would become the name of his family, which would then become the name of a clan as it grows, which becomes the name of a tribe, which becomes the name of a nation or people, which becomes the name of a region where they lived. Okay? And then furthermore, a capital city could refer to a nation, like, Washington and Moscow had talks. What does that mean? Well, that's clear to us, right? Washington and Moscow had talk. We're actually referring to the nations, or we're talking about the representatives of the nations, but we use it in terms of talking about capital cities. So oftentimes they talk about a capital city to refer to a nation or a people. Like they might talk about Zion. Zion is one of the hills in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is built on a mountain, which is really a little mountain range, or a set of large hills, and Mount Zion is one, and Mount Moriah was another. Anyway, that became Mount Moriah became the Temple Mount. Anyway, a capital city could refer to a nation, city, region, names change, borders change. So if you don't follow what's happening, the jostling between all these nations and regions, then it can be really hard to follow what's going on in the historical books or in the prophets. And by the way, just a note, we do not have a class next week because it's House Church Sunday. We do have a class 2 weeks from now, and I will be coming back with the prophets. Okay? So anyway, what we've got here is we see Ephraim. Here's Ephraim. Who was Ephraim? He was actually you know what? I've got a slide for this. So what I'm going to do today is expose you to a ton of names and a ton of maps that fortunately you have access to, right, by going to the course webpage. And for the time being, that's at nrcoc.org/Bible. So if you go there, you'll get to the course webpage, and you'll be able to get this presentation. So you'll have access to all these maps. Okay? But here are the 12 sons of Jacob, which are the 12 sons of Israel, right? And you would think that those 12 would be the 12 tribes. Well, here's the deal. Levi was set aside to be a tribe of priests. So they didn't get an allocation of land after the conquest like all the other 12 tribes. So Levi is not considered one of the 12 tribes. There's the tribe of Levi, but they're interspersed. They're the tribe of priests. They're interspersed among all the other 12 tribes. And Joseph was an honored son. While the Bible doesn't really talk about this specifically, his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, got to be two of the 12 tribes. So Joseph, if you will, gained what's called the double portion. And oh, by the way, Ephraim the younger was blessed by his father Jacob above Manasseh. And so Ephraim was honored above Manasseh. And what you'll see is that the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, that is all those other tribes in the north, they're often referred to as Ephraim. So let's just read through. Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher and Issachar and Zebulun and Joseph, or more specifically Manasseh and Ephraim and Benjamin. You're going to hear these names come up a lot. And they refer to not these people, but to their descendants and the regions in which those descendants lived, or the land that they were allocated. It's important also that we get oriented with regard to geography, okay? I think everyone will recognize the Mediterranean Sea. You're all familiar with the Mediterranean Sea. You're all familiar with Italy and Greece and Turkey. And you're probably familiar that Israel is down here at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. This map is showing the descendants of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their descendants. So Canaan was a descendant of Ham. Do you remember Ham was cursed by Noah? And specifically his son Canaan? And all these Sidonians, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arakites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, Hamathites. These are all descendants of Canaan. So the descendants of Ham were the Canaanites. And oh, by the way, who are the descendants of Shem? They're referred to today as Semites. Okay? And the Semites included Abraham and his family, and so anyway, I wasn't going to spend all this time on all the names on here. I'm just saying that you could go back and familiarize yourself with the names, and you may find that those pop up in your reading. And these are all ancient names, really ancient names. Okay, this is before the conquest. Genesis 10 is called the Table of Nations, and it describes all those peoples. But at the time of Abraham, get familiar. Here's where Babylon started. Babylonia, the kingdom of Babylonia, it had its two major cities in Ur, which is where Abraham was born, and Babylon. Okay? Meanwhile, here's the kingdom of Elam, centered at Susa, which is where the story of Esther takes place, in what's called the citadel of Susa. Up here is Assyria, and its main city is Nineveh. I don't remember reading about in the Bible the kingdom of Mari, so there's that. And then here's the kingdom of Egypt. So just to be familiar with the historic kingdoms and where they came from. Okay, these are the names of the cities in Canaan in the time of the patriarchs. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Remember, then during Jacob's time, they all went to Israel. So the cities that are named in the Torah are different than the cities sometimes than the cities that are named in the historical books, because it's been 400 and 500 years. And, some of the cities are named different. Take note here. See this city called Salem? Do you remember who came from Salem? Melchizedek. Melchizedek was from the city, was a king of the city of Salem. He was also a high priest. And Salem is what became Jebus, is what became Jerusalem. So it's the same city. And Mount Moriah, where Abraham was prepared to sacrifice his son, Isaac, is in fact the mountain in Jerusalem, which is the Temple Mount. So the temple was built on what was originally Mount Moriah. So again, just that the city names change, and if you want to be oriented, then you have to have some access to the geography. Okay, here is the Exodus. The Jews were, that is the descendants of Israel, of Jacob, were in Goshen. When they left Egypt, they came out, they went across the Red Sea at some place, maybe, maybe some narrow place, not sure. And they went into the wilderness. In coming through the wilderness, they first came to Sinai, and they got the 10 Commandments, and they got the law. They actually went up to the southern border of Canaan. They spied it out, and they were terrified by what they saw. And then God said, okay, you're going to wander in the desert for 40 years because you didn't trust me enough. So then they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. And then when they came up in Numbers, they came up here and they defeated 2 kings on the east side of the Jordan. And it was there at Mount Nebo that Moses went up on the mountain and died. So let's see if I've gotten ahead of myself. Okay, Canaan before Israel's arrival. So before Israel, there was Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And then these are the Amorites. So the Amorites, including King Sihon and King Og, who are mentioned, sort of ruled over the eastern side of the Jordan. And the Canaanites had the western side of the Jordan. And these were the names of the big cities. But the first thing that the Israelites did when they came up here, they actually defeated Sihon and Og. And so this green part shows Israel taking over. They skipped over Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Okay, and this is in Numbers 21. But what happened was their conquest of these people on the eastern side of the Jordan River caused everyone on the western side of the Jordan River to quake in fear. They heard about this giant, million-strong group of people moving through the land and conquering all their neighbors, and they were quaking in fear. And so when they do you remember their first conquest once they crossed the Jordan River? Jericho. It's right here. Their second city they attacked where they had a humiliating defeat was Ai, right here. So that was a humiliating defeat. They went back and they sought the guidance of the Lord. But you see what's happening here. So we now understand how it works. We understand when we read about the cities, we can place them. We know what's going on. Okay. Even Israel's enemies are related to them. Look, here's Israel, the Israelites are the descendants of Jacob, who is renamed Israel. But Israel, or Jacob, had a brother named Esau, also called Edom. That was one of his other names. So the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Over here, Abraham had a brother named Haran, whose son was Lot. And his sons were Moab and Ben-Ammi, from whom were descended the Moabites and the Ammonites. I did some research on the Arameans, and it's possible that they were descended from, this branch way up here, a son of Shem named Aram. It might be that they were descended from a son of Nahor named Aram. I'm not exactly sure. Canaan after the conquest. So after the conquest, didn't completely drive out the Canaanites. And if you read in the book of Joshua, it says they didn't completely drive out the Canaanites. And there came a point where their disobedience was such that God said, fine, I'm just going to let the Canaanites stay. So what we have here is after, quote unquote, the conquest, where they conquered a lot of the promised land, but didn't get everything. Then they went and they allocated, and this is enumerated in Joshua. Each tribe was given their land, and they were given instructions. You must continue to drive out the Canaanites. So in other words, the conquest had 2 phases. There was the united phase where Israel is going and the whole nation of Israel is going and driving out people. And then they got to a point where they said, okay, that's good enough for now. Let's divvy up the land. Here are your assignments. And everybody went back and settled. And then it was up to each tribe to continue to reclaim or to claim the land that had been promised to them. So during the Judges, here's the nation of Israel. You can see Aram is making inroads from the north, and now the Canaanites that were there's some question about were the Philistines actually Canaanites or were they seafaring people that came and populated. I think the best understanding is that the Philistines were actually seafaring peoples that came and populated. But anyway, Philistia and the Philistines, you'll read about a lot. The Canaanites still had places in the north, still had some places here. You see, Jerusalem was not under the control of the Israelites during the period of the Judges. And in fact, you'll remember that the conquest of Jerusalem was a big thing in the life of David. David actually said, whoever can lead the army and conquer Jerusalem, I'm going to make you captain of my military. And Joab did it. And then David actually made Jerusalem the capital. But Hebron was the major city in the south. Okay? So we see over here that this is according to the tribes. This is according to a slightly different view. So when you're reading the Judges, I think this map, it will be very helpful to you in comparing the cities and regions sort of as they were effectively, and then specifically how that mapped to the tribes and what their allocations were. Then after King Saul, David was announced the king, but Saul's son Ishbosheth kind of had the loyalties of the people, of a certain set of people. Ishbosheth's capital was in Mahanaim, and David's capital was in Hebron. So it took a while to unify the nation. And now you can see why Jerusalem would be a strategic capital city for David, because it was a unifying city that was not part of David's half of Israel or Ishbosheth's half of Israel. Jerusalem was a city that was still occupied by the Jebusites, or the Jebusites. Okay, but during the reign of King David, he expanded his territory significantly. And by the way, these purple areas are identified as conquered kingdoms of influence. So according to this map and this scholarship, it describes David as having really ruled all this area. It had significant influence over the purple areas. He ruled over the green areas. Okay? Israel during Solomon was even further. After the divided kingdom, you see here's Judah, here's Israel. Right now we're split up. We're no longer a unified kingdom. We're a divided kingdom. And here's the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire comes over, took over most of Judah. They were just unable to capture Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is this little island of God's people in the middle of the Assyrian Empire. Now remember, the center of Assyria is Nineveh, and you'll remember that Jonah was sent as a prophet to Nineveh. But then the Babylonians come along. And the Babylonians are centered at Babylon, but they take over everything that was Assyrian, including Nineveh. And they take over all this land. Now, you may wonder, why are all these kingdoms, why do they look like this little horseshoe? This is what's called the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent, does that ring a bell in anyone's recollections? These rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, created a very fertile area for farming. And so there was a lot of civilization in this half. But also Canaan was very fertile. So this is the Fertile Crescent. If you wanted to go from Babylon to there, you don't go across the Arabian desert. You go where it's fertile. So you see their rivers and their coastlines and all that good stuff. So there's always this shape So the Babylonian Empire was replaced with the Persian Empire with its capitals at Susa and Persepolis. Okay? And then the Persian Empire, after the return from exile by the Persians, right? These were the districts. And so we start to see, okay, now these are going to be named by the conquerors, by the ones who are sending the people back. So there's Judah, Samaria. Now we get some different names coming in, some slightly different borders coming in. And then here's the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. He takes over, and it's amazing. He's from Greece. It's like everything east. Now, this was not during the period of the Old Testament history, but Daniel references the kingdom of Greece. He could see that Greece was on the rise. And then the Greek Empire went through a couple of changes after Alexander's death. I don't have time to explain these. And then the Jews got independence from the Greek Empire for a period of time, and then eventually got conquered by the Romans. So, you know what? That's all we have time for today. Wow. So you've been exposed to a lot of geography and history. And just go back and look at those and expose yourself to the names, and maybe look at the appropriate map while you're reading the appropriate book. And may the Lord bless you as you continue to absorb such things